Welcome to Skyscape's free webinar series. Today's topic is Next Gen using mobile tools. I'm Kristen Snowden-Smith from Skyscape, and I will be the moderator today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand with a copy of the presentation. We will notify you when it is available via email. If you have questions during the webinar presentation, please post them in the chat window, and we will get to them during our short Q&A at the end of the presentation. Our speaker today is Dr. Tim Bristol. Tim is a faculty and student success specialist, and he works with a number of colleges and universities and resides in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Tim has been utilizing technology in the classroom, clinical, and lab setting for over 20 years. His motto is, "Today we will learn how to learn." I will now hand the floor over to Dr. Bristol.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us. I do appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to kind of take a peek, take a look, kind of just consider what's happening with the new NCLEX, what's happening with clinical judgment, and why it's happening. I want to see here how you're doing related to your updates on clinical judgment and the whole Next Gen NCLEX. So when you think about the Next Gen NCLEX, keep in mind that this is based on their observations, National Council's observations in the clinical setting. Their observations of what is happening with new nurses. So for instance, and these statistics were updated last month, we had a national meeting that we were all at. For instance, 50% of people passing NCLEX will be involved in a medical error shortly after passing NCLEX. Okay, 50%. In 2019, we know that only 1 in 10, the actual number is 11%, 11% of new nurses were practice ready when they were evaluated in practice, okay? We also know in 2019, the third leading cause of death in America, any guesses? Anybody want to chat it in? Anybody being shy this afternoon? It was medical errors. The third leading cause of death in America in 2019 was medical errors. Can you tell I'm avoiding 2020? I'm going to pretend like it didn't happen. How's that for denial? But the idea behind clinical judgment, this whole model was built because of those types of observations in the practice setting. Okay, so that's very important for us to understand. Now, the other things that we need to understand is based on this observation, they went out and did research, and thousands of seasoned nurses, seasoned educators following around new nurses. I'm sorry, not thousands. It was actually, I believe the number was closer to 750 following thousands of new nurses. And they put together these models kind of describing what goes on in a day in the life of a new nurse. And clinical judgment came right to the top as the #1 need and one of the primary reasons for these problems for new nurses. So they did all this research, they pulled all this together, they went to our matron saints of nursing theory like Tanner and Benner and Lassiter, and they said, okay, let's build this model of clinical judgment. And basically, clinical judgment is the, go ahead and write this down, this is going to be on the test, okay? There's going to be a test afterwards. Clinical judgment is the doing, everybody say the word doing. Good, I heard all of you. It's the doing that happens after critical thinking, okay? So you got to remember that. We are learning by doing. We have to learn by doing. We have to learn in the same way in which we will use the information. If you're not familiar with the clinical judgment model, please go to ncsbn.org, ncsbn.org, And in the search bar in the upper right-hand corner, type in these 3 letters, NGN. NGN, Next Generation NCLEX. Type in NGN in the search bar in the upper right-hand corner of National Council's website, and it will take you to all of the clinical judgment resources that they have there that describe the model. And it will also give you the background for that model. You're going to be excited to find out that learning by doing is the educational and in many times the theoretical background and framework for this new clinical judgment model. As you start looking at these resources, you're going to see it everywhere. Don't just go to the website and go, hey, how do I write a matrix question? Hey, how do I write a closed drop-down question? Don't just go to their website to figure out how to write a test item. More importantly, we need to go look at that research, look at those examples, look at those samples. How do I teach this way? Those terrible statistics that I shared with you on what's happening in practice right now are not a result of poorly written exams. They're a result of learning that was incomplete. Learning that did not fully meet the needs of the learner when they are in a realistic environment. We're going to take a look at some mobile tools. We're going to take a look at some mobile tools here that are going to help you start to make that transition, start to move towards clinical judgment on a moment-by-moment basis, okay? The doing that happens after critical thinking, that doing, what is the nurse doing? What is the nurse up to? Let me give you an example. Tim just graduated from your nursing program. Tim passes NCLEX the first time, of course, because I graduated from your nursing program and you are an awesome nursing instructor. Of course, I graduated and passed the first time on NCLEX. And then I get my very first job and I go through my 90-day orientation, right? Hopefully it was 90 days. My first day after orientation, day number 91. I have 5 patients. I have 1 circling the drain. I have a doctor calling on the phone that's upset with me because I didn't do something that they had asked. I have a significant other in room 348 that's crying. And I just got another phone call from the nursing supervisor saying I'm going to get an admission in 5 minutes. And I hang that phone up, the elevator bell dings, the door opens, there's my admission. It was not 5 minutes, it was more like 5 seconds. That's reality. How many of your students got to have that experience? How many of your students before they graduated truly had that experience, all those different things happening at the same time? We've got to find a way. We've got to find a way of helping the students on a moment-by-moment basis, learning by doing, being a part of that doing infrastructure. And this requires a student-centered learning approach. We have to be very careful. We cannot say that the faculty are going to control this, the faculty are going to drive this, if the students are just kind of sitting there as passive recipients, okay? We have to make sure that the students are actually experiencing that realism, that realistic piece with every learning experience. And so this is where that learning by doing comes into play. The other thing that I want to say about clinical judgment requires the students to constantly be evaluated and or evaluating themselves. By constantly, I literally mean weekly, if not daily. Okay? And so the strategies and tools I'm about to show you are going to show you how to help your learners get feedback frequently. And feedback that is not faculty-centered, but feedback that is more student-centered. How can I evaluate myself as a student? How can I get my buddy to evaluate me and give me feedback? You see, if you've got a classroom of 20 students, or 80 students or 120 students? How are you going to be able to give them feedback on a daily, weekly basis? How are you doing right now today with clinical judgment? You see, when it comes to clinical judgment, these are some key issues. We got to learn by doing. We've got to make sure that the student is doing it, not watching you do it. And we've got to make sure that the student is constantly getting feedback. Let's take a look at some tools that really get to the heart of this higher order thinking area. And I'm going to show you some tools that help you learn, help your students learn in the same way in which they will use the information in practice. Okay, this is super important. If I sat in your lecture, let's say that you lecture Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings from 9 a.m. to 9:50 a.m. At 9:50 a.m. each of those 3 days, would I feel like I was just in a clinical experience? A majority of the classroom observations that I do have done, the answer would be emphatically no. There is no similarity, no connection. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some tools here and see how they can show up in the classroom and start stimulating clinical judgment muscle exercise in the classroom, while at the same time also be useful in the clinical setting. And they kind of start to create that bridge. These same tools overlap. For instance, we're going to look at the notebook here in a moment. The notebook is a clinical judgment journal where the students are taking notes as if they were taking care of a patient. We're going to look at some clinical-based, evidence-based practice tools, okay, that normally would show up in clinical. We're going to discuss how they need to be literally in every hour of every lecture. And if your students are not allowed to use mobile devices in the clinical setting, they need to use mobile devices even more in the classroom setting, getting access to that evidence-based practice on the fly. When we talk about the connection of clinical judgment to evidence-based practice, the evidence-based practice has got to be on the fly. Okay, let me explain. When I graduated nursing school, now granted, this was a different century, I thought evidence-based practice meant I have to go to the library and I have to find 3 journal articles that are longer than 3 pages that are not editorials and cannot be bought at the grocery store. That was the definition of evidence-based practice. And I had to use that when I went to clinical, that information. What new nurse in what clinical setting can do that these days? I have a friend that's a new nurse at a local long-term care facility. Half the time, half of the CNAs or the CNA roles are not filled, and nurses are filling in for that CNA role. Do they have time in the middle of their shift to carve out an hour, go to the basement of that long-term care facility, get on that one computer hooked up to that one system and find those journal articles? The answer emphatically is no. Clinical judgment requires evidence-based practice on the fly. What kind of habits of accessing evidence-based practice have you built into your students? I want to talk to the faculty teaching fundamentals real quick. Many times the faculty teaching fundamentals are like, oh good, evidence-based practice is taught later in the program, or it's taught in that last course, or leadership, or research. Well, what we've found out, especially over the past 10 plus years, 10 to 15 years, is that fundamentals is the most important course, or that semester 1 of nursing school is the most important course in your curriculum, okay? So when I talk about learning evidence-based practice on the fly, I'm talking about using these tools in fundamentals. Super critical, super important that that happens. So when you look at these mobile tools, and Kristen's going to tell you how you can actually load some of these on your phone, try them out. You're going to see that these tools, especially here with, for instance, the drug guide I'm going to show you here in a moment, connected with that MedSurg Clinical Companion, all on their phone. Because of the index in these, because of the cross-referencing and the smart linking, that clinical connection, if you will, because of the bookmarks and the history, the new nurse or your nursing student in the middle of your lecture can now build a habit of quickly accessing the current evidence base from a trusted resource that is, if you desire, automatically updated. Okay, we're not using the 2017 drug guide that's sitting on the counter back behind the computer next to the med room. Okay, we literally are using a current updated resource. Okay, so they're able to get to the evidence base right away, create a habit of using the evidence base on the fly. Let me give you an example here, okay? And if you haven't written down this phrase yet, go ahead and write it down. EBP, okay, which stands for evidence-based practice on the fly. Go ahead and write that down somewhere. That's a really important concept for you to address. So let's say that you are teaching fundamentals. Okay, I'm going to keep picking on the fundamentals instructors here. You're teaching fundamentals, and you're teaching about patients who are at risk for infection. Okay, and how do I help those patients? What are the generalities? What should I be looking for? Well, what does that look like in real practice? In real practice, and in your very first fundamentals clinical that you're going to go to here in just 3 weeks, you're going to have patients with, you guessed it, rheumatoid arthritis. That's right. You're going to have students with rheumatoid arthritis, and those patients tend to be at risk for infection. Now, I want us to start learning about at risk for infection in context. Can you all write down the word context? Go ahead and write that word down somewhere. Kristen and I were just talking about our children. My 17-year-old is notorious for writing words down during school, either on a piece of clothing or on her hand. We bought her notebooks. I promise. We bought her notebooks, but she doesn't write them on the notebook. She writes these really important words on her hand. So if you want to, you can do what Willow does. You could write the word context on your hand. Your students have to learn in context. Just because you're a fabulous instructor and you taught them about patients at risk for infection, guess what? This brings the context. They type in rheumatoid arthritis when they open up their Skyscape Medical Library, their SML, they do the smart search, they type in rheumatoid arthritis, and sure enough, in their MedSurg Clinical Companion, okay, their MedSurg Clinical Companion, they're going to find rheumatoid arthritis, and then they get to the monograph on rheumatoid arthritis. Now, follow me here for a moment. Students, it's now time for you to get with a buddy. You both have rheumatoid arthritis on your phones. You've gone into your clinical companion. You found it through a smart search. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I want you guys to look through the monograph on rheumatoid arthritis, and I want you to try to come up with, why do you think these patients are at risk for infection? Wait a minute, Tim. These are fundamental students, and we haven't lectured on rheumatoid arthritis. So is this really fair, Tim? Should you really be doing this, Tim? Rheumatoid arthritis is a very complex disease. Should that be in fundamentals lecture, Tim? Well, my question to you is, and this is what helps me. This is what helps Tim. When they go to their very first clinical in long-term care, and remember, that's just 3 weeks away, when they go to their very first clinical in long-term care, are you going to say to them in long-term care, I'm sorry, I haven't lectured on rheumatoid arthritis, so today you cannot take care of Mrs. Smith. I'm sorry, I have not lectured on diabetes mellitus type 2, so today you cannot care for Mr. Lightfoot. You see where I'm going with this, right? In lecture, we need to keep it real. And this clinical-based tool, what you're teaching them is a habit. You're doing this hourly. They're learning about patients at risk for infection by using a clinical-based tool, because remember, they have to do this in clinical. If they can't use their phones in clinical, they have to go find a computer, go find another resource. You're going to make evidence-based practice on the fly such a key part of the way they do business as a nurse that when they get into the clinical setting, they're going to lead others. They're going to be looking for that quick, updated, critical information on the fly. They come in here, they find rheumatoid arthritis, they look through the monograph, the students have picked out one or two things that they think are absolutely critical, and you're like, okay, students, now what I need you to do is I need you to go back into, I'll back up here, I apologize, I got ahead of myself. Go back into the menu, click on Smart Link. Okay, click on Smart Link. So you're gonna click on the little compass down here, then click on Smart Link and go to your drug guide. And it pulls up rheumatoid arthritis in the Davis drug guide. Okay, and now students, I want you to look at a medication called methotrexate. And you're like, wait a minute, Tim, time out, buddy. Tim, these are fundamental students. Should we be doing this? Well, again, I go back to that day in clinical. Are you going to say to them, I haven't lectured to you yet on methotrexate, therefore you can't take care of Mrs. Smith? No. When we're talking about patients who are at risk for infection, methotrexate's a big part of that puzzle, even though we're only in fundamentals. So students, go ahead and open up methotrexate. I want you to get with your buddy. I want the two of you to look through this monograph on this particular medication. I know it's going to be tough for you. I'm only going to give you 5 minutes. I want you to try to come up with, why do you think this medication would make someone at risk for infection? And they're looking through here, and they're going to be clicking on this area and that area and the assessment area. And they're like, okay, we think it's this. You're building clinical judgment muscles, faculty. This exercise is building clinical judgment muscles that are absolutely essential to the clinical judgment that's needed when they're a brand new baby nurse and they have 5 patients and 1 on the way. We need these muscles to start being developed day 1 of nursing school. Once they get into this area and they've looked at the different places, now they can go to their notebook, that clinical judgment journal. And here's where they start prioritizing. Not prioritizing based on pathology and this and that, but prioritizing on, okay, there's a lot of information flowing around. The EHR has a lot of information. When I go to the evidence base, I've always got to prioritize. I can't look at the 5 pages on Tylenol and think all 5 pages are absolutely critical. I've always got to prioritize. So they go into their notebook, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment, and it links directly to that, and they can start adding information there. If they need to, they can get back into the other parts, their drug guide, their clinical companion, whatever they need to do, quickly moving through the evidence base that is updated, current, and safe. We've got to build these habits. That's absolutely essential for clinical judgment. And when you look at the sample test items for the next generation NCLEX, you're going to start seeing information. You're going to start seeing information that's been pulled out of electronic resources like this. You're going to start seeing information where they have to look at that information, and that goes into the whole thing related to clinical judgment. Can you take care of this patient? I'm going to move on to the journal here for a few moments. The NurseThink Notebook, it basically allows the students to take notes as if they were taking care of a patient. When we talk about care planning, when we talk about note taking, a lot of different things can bubble up. What's absolutely critical in this process is that the student, on a moment-by-moment basis, is literally doing clinical judgment. They're note-taking as if they were taking care of a patient. So no matter what's going on with the patient today, you're going to find it in the notebook, okay? This can be everything from asthma to COVID, and there are blanks as well, excuse me, if you can't find exactly what you're looking for. So they go to that area, and what we do with students, the way that we train them is to always try to do some compare and contrast. What else might be related to this, whether it's a concept, a disease, a system, no matter what it is, okay? What else is related? What else could impact it? So for instance, if you're running out of oxygen, you're gonna have a hard time moving. Mobility could be related to oxygenation that way. So we train your students to always function from a compare and contrast mindset. Then we train them to start looking at what's going on in their resources as if they were taking care of a patient. You're not just reading chapter 42 thinking that every single word in chapter 42 of your med-surg book is absolutely important to memorize. You're prioritizing. You're pretending like you're taking care of a patient. You use the notebook in clinical as well. The exact same part of the monograph, okay? And if they're not allowing students to bring their laptops or their phones, that's not a problem. They can very easily, from their laptop or their phone, their notes will sync over both devices. They can easily print out and take it with them, or they can go into post-conference, go into the break room, go into the back of the nurse's station, wherever they're allowed to use that device, and start updating their notes that way as well. But the idea here is no matter what they're working on, they're going to have a similar flow of how they manage that information, the compare and contrast, taking notes as if you're taking care of a patient, and taking notes in clinical and lab in the exact same location, okay? If I'm working on gas exchange and oxygenation in peds today, and we're covering the exemplar, the disease of asthma, I go to that asthma monograph. And then to this week in clinical, I have a patient with asthma. I go back to that same area in the app. And then we have lab this week and we have a simulation and it's an asthma case study. I go back to that same place. Every time that topic comes up, I go back to the same place in the app and I keep building and adjusting and editing. This is my journal of my clinical judgment journey. You'll notice after they get through these areas, then they have to go into their prioritization areas. We are using the clinical judgment model. You recognize, recognize and analyze cues. You're going to see that just like you see in the clinical judgment model. You're going to notice that we always have the students prioritizing. We never allow them to just list 100 things. What's the priority for this patient? Well, it says in the book, if they're pregnant, they can't take this drug. Well, the fact that they're a male might mean that that doesn't apply. You've all been there. You know exactly what I'm saying. We always are having the students do the prioritization. The only way to learn to prioritize is to do it. If you put up a PowerPoint slide on the big screen tomorrow in lecture, and it says priorities of care, emphysema, and there's bullets on that slide, that is not helping them learn how to prioritize. All that is doing is encouraging them to memorize. They're going to memorize the bullets you put on that slide because they know you're going to write the test item off of that slide. They memorize the bullets, they go to the exam, they get that question right, and they move on. At no point in time are they learning to prioritize. The only way to learn to prioritize is to do it. And you're going to see that in the app. The app also has places where they can start to add some of their own creativity, or maybe they heard a mnemonic. They're going to be challenged on quality and safety and just a few bullets here and there. And then there are also going to be areas where they can document, my buddy, BJ, looked at my monograph. We got to class and Professor Kristen had us all stand up. We were supposed to have two 2 monographs filled out in the app as our ticket to class. And Professor Kristen has us all stand up, all 82 of us, and find someone in the room we haven't yet talked to today. I talked to BJ. And BJ and I got our phones out. We opened up the respiration, oxygenation, or medication abuse, or whatever it is. And we compared, did we have the same priorities? Did we have the same clinical judgment focus? Why or why not? BJ and I compared. So even though there were 82 students in Professor Kristen's lecture, every one of those 82 students got feedback because BJ and I were comparing our priorities. And you have multiple prioritization areas that you can compare. And so this is a very powerful tool to help build that clinical judgment muscle. The notebook is meant to be implemented day one of nursing school in fundamentals. It's used every day of lecture, every day of lab, every day of clinical, every time they're studying. They're opening up their notebook app and just spending a few minutes jotting down a few bullets. Faculty, this is not meant to be graded, okay? It's not meant to be graded. If anything, what we do with faculty is we will train them. Hey, just spend a few times asking them to come with 2 monographs filled out as a ticket to class, and then just spend 10 minutes in the middle of every lecture, have them get up out of their chairs and compare with someone else. Students, you'll have 2 filled out before every lab. And then in the middle of lab, we're just going to spend 10 minutes. Students, for the first 10 minutes of every post-conference after clinical, your faculty are going to have you partner up with a buddy, and you're going to open up your notebook, and in that app, you're just going to make a few edits, a few tweaks, a few documents based on what happened today in clinical. You keep doing that week after week after week, from day one of nursing school until the day you take NCLEX. This exercise builds that clinical judgment muscle. All right, so I want to go to Q&A. Kristen, I apologize. How are we doing on Q&A there?
We have a couple of questions, and just a reminder, if anyone didn't hear the beginning, you can type your questions in the chat. But a couple that have come in, and you might have touched it, but do I need to change my lesson plan to use these tools?
No. As a matter of fact, as you're moving towards clinical judgment, we don't encourage you to change your lesson plans or syllabi right out of the gate. You can start having students purchase their drug guide, their clinical companion inside of Skyscape right away. The notebook works with any type of curriculum, whether you're systems-based, competency-based, concept-based, doesn't matter. The whole point of these tools is allowing your students to do clinical judgment activities on a moment-by-moment basis. So you don't even have to change your PowerPoints. Just please give us 10 minutes in the middle of lecture to do a NurseThink break. Give your students 10 minutes in the middle of lecture to do evidence-based practice on the fly. Great question. Thank you.
Let's see, you answered the question of when is the best time to implement the notebook app, saying
fundamentals, yes.
Fundamentals. How do these tools work if a student has English as a second language?
Fantastic. This is a really good point, because a lot of times when we're in a clinical setting, so many of your students with English as a second language have studied so hard to learn perfect English, okay? And many of them are way better when it comes to grammar and all those different points and pieces than I am, that's for sure. When you're using clinical-based tools, one thing to keep in mind is nurse speak. You all know what I'm talking about. Nurse speak, medical speak, quick medical bullets oftentimes breaks all the rules. What this means is, sure, this student with ESL, ELL has done great academically, but then they get in the clinical setting and they have all kinds of problems. Using those Skyscape-based tools in class allows them in the middle of your class to see nurse speak, to experience nurse speak. The notebook. The notebook is an excellent opportunity for them to start to create their own understanding of nurse think, nurse speak. They're doing it as if they were taking care of patients. Then if you allow them, if you can just give them 10 minutes in every lecture, lab, and clinical post-conference to talk to someone else. And you'll notice what I said, Kristen. I said, find someone in the room you haven't yet talked to today. Bobby, you and Susan can't keep partnering up during these activities. You've got to find a different partner every day. So you start hearing it in different ways. So great question.
And then one other thing is you mentioned that the notebook obviously is a personal thing used for tools. How in the long term will it help across the curriculum, whether it's studying, time saving, those type of things?
Got it. So the students, so when a student goes from Tim's class to Kristen's class, Professor Smith's class, Professor Juarez's lecture, many times they get there and they're like, okay, I'm now in Professor Juarez's world. I'm now in Professor Kristen's world. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Whereas the notebook, for instance, becomes the great equalizer. Whether they're in Tim's class or Kristen's class or Professor Juarez's class, they get to take notes the same way, as if they were taking care of a patient. And then even more powerful, they get to use that exact same tool in clinical. It's the great equalizer for the student, because in traditional situations, they're like, okay, Kristen teaches nothing like what Tim does. Tim is super confusing. Kristen has all these huge bibliographies. Dr. Juarez speaks way too fast, and the students are just like all over the place. Whereas the notebook allows them to focus clinically, even in Tim's class when Tim is super confusing. Great question.
How does the notebook help with studying for exams?
Oh, I love this question. When it comes to studying for an exam, the idea here is the students got to the most critical information. When there's no format for taking notes, one of two things happen. Overload, as in every single thing is important and I'm just going to memorize the PowerPoints, or complete avoidance. I'm just going to go read the chapter again because, well, they told me to. So I'm just going to go read the chapter again. With the notebook, they start to create this habit of focusing on everything from a clinical judgment perspective. So whether they gathered information from Professor Kristen's PowerPoint slides, or whether they gathered the information from the textbook that Dr. Juarez uses, or whether they gathered the information from a lab activity when they did lab with Tim, they're gathering it in the same way, focusing on that clinical setting. Now I'll step into test item writing for just a moment. The best test items, especially if you're thinking about Next Gen and clinical judgment, the best test items sound like, feel like you're in a clinical setting. If I look at a test item, an instructor says, hey, Tim, is this a good test item? And I look at it and it doesn't look, sound, feel like a clinical setting, it is not a good test item. It might be a good pop quiz item. It might be a good item for a game in class, but it is not a good test item. We have to test clinically. The new NCLEX that's coming out in 2023 is all clinical. It's even more clinical than what we've ever seen before. But we have to teach clinically first. The students have to learn clinically, way more importantly, because clinical is having a lot of problems right now.
Okay, thank you, Tim. That seems
You
to
bet.
wrap up our questions. You want to advance to the next slide for me?
Yes, yes, yes. There we go.
And
Is this where they can download the app, do
they
a
can get the
sample?
app, so you can download the app. The Skyscape Medical Library app is available in your app stores, Google Play or the Apple. You can download the app. If you would like to request an evaluation copy of any of the resources we have mentioned today, or any of them that we have in our library of over 100 resources, you can go to education.skyscape.com/nursing and fill out the evaluation form. Go to the next slide.
All right.
The same for the NurseThink notebook. If you go to nursethink.skyscape.com, there's a video there on how it's used by faculty. There's also one by students, and there's information where you can request an evaluation of this tool. Next slide. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy days to attend our webinar. As I already said, you can get the app on the app stores. You can request an evaluation copy at education.skyscape.com. For more tips on NurseThink, you can go to nursethink.skyscape.com. The webinar will be available on demand later this week at education.skyscape.com/webinars. And if you have any questions, you can email us at webinar@skyscape.com. We invite you to attend or register for our next webinar, Skills, a Mobile Approach for Nursing Student of the 21st Century. That is being held next week on October 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central. To register for this, you can go to education.skyscape.com/webinars. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.